Eva. I'm the intern at the Maison Française and a journalism student here. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you today for our panel discussion inaugurating the series Journalism and Crisis, organized with the Columbia Global Center and the English and the Maison Française. Today we are welcoming Sylvie Kauffmann to discuss about her new book, The Blindsided, with Alexander Steele, the Sao Paulo International Journalism Professor at Columbia. Sylvie Kauffmann is a foreign affairs columnist for the French newspaper Le Monde. She also contributes to the opinion pages of the Financial Times, and she has published several articles in the New York Times. She joined Le Monde in 1988 as a Central and Eastern Europe correspondent and witnessed from the front row the fall of the Soviet bloc. She then covered the US and Southeast Asia and became the first female editor-in-chief of Le Monde in 2010 and 2011. Alexander Steele is a journalist, author, and professor at the journalism school. He wrote mainly about France and Italy. He has been a regular contributor to The New Yorker and La Repubblica, one of the most widely read newspapers in Italy. Among his books, let me mention The Side of Rome, How a Beautiful European Country with a Famous History, and another title, Story Culture, was taken over by a man named Silvio Berlusconi. The Blindsided is a book exploring the what-ifs of the European diplomatic history since the fall of the Soviet Union. Sylvie Kauffmann breaks down key international summits, giving us both vivid anecdotes and also a very detailed historical background. Through an impressive amount of interviews collected, Sylvie Kauffmann questions why France and Germany chose to ignore any warning signals about Putin's plan for 2 decades. And the book also explores how leaders' egos and personality can sometimes weigh on international relationships. And as a journalism student, my professor keeps telling me that great writing comes from great reporting. And I think Sylvie Kauffmann's book would be a perfect example for that. It's a journalistic accomplishment, transmitting a huge amount of research through a clear and appealing writing style, and I'm looking forward to hearing about it.
So, one of the big questions that your book seems to me to pose is, did Vladimir Putin change during the 20-odd years he's been in power? Or, for example, you quote Angela Merkel and some of her advisors saying that Putin became harder over time. Other people that you interviewed, a Polish leader who meets Putin early on, who quotes Putin as being very plain about his intention to reconstitute a greater Russia. Where do you end up with this question of, did Putin change, or did we fail to understand who he was from the beginning?
Well, first of all, thank you very, very much for having me here, and thank you, Eva, for these very kind words. It's really a pleasure to be in New York, and an honor really to be in Columbia University at La Maison Française. This question that you ask is really fundamental, of course. Did Putin change, or did we? Maybe Emmanuel Macron, his advisors like to say the world changed. Macron didn't change. Just he changed his opinion on Putin, and but he said no, he did. The president didn't change. It's the world which changed. And I think regarding Vladimir Putin, it doesn't work. No. Okay. Regarding Vladimir Putin, I think the fundamental features of his ambition and of his political character were there from the beginning. I mean, everybody knows that he was trained as a KGB officer. He was very much a Soviet man. And he's on record saying that the fall of the Soviet Union is the greatest geopolitical catastrophe in the 20th century. So 20th century, which doesn't lack geopolitical catastrophes, but I mean that's his choice, and that's a revealing choice, I think. And so we can go through the different stages of his presidency, since he's been there now for a quarter of a century almost. He arrived in 2000. But I think I would, you mentioned the the former Polish president, Aleksander Kwaśniewski, who talked to him in 2002. And I think he saw through Putin's real ambition, and that scared him. And I think he's the one who was right eventually. So maybe to tell you about this this anecdote. I mean, it's more than an anecdote. It's Kwaśniewski was a former Polish Communist Party official. He was a member of the Central Committee in the late 80s, and he was among the young reformers of the party. But he was in power. And when after the collapse of communism, he converted into a nice social democrat, or Polish sort of, and he was elected democratically president for 2 terms, and he was actually quite a good president. But anyway, so in 2002 he had been president for 7 years, and he on a trip back from Asia, he decided to make a stopover in Moscow to have a talk with Putin, who was then almost 2 years in office. So he said, I was an old president, and I wanted to meet him as he was a young president. So they had a very long conversation, he told me, because they spoke Russian together. Since he was a communist, Kwaśniewski, he spoke good Russian. And so he said their conversation lasted for several hours in the night in the apartment at the Kremlin. And so Kwaśniewski asked Putin, what are your main ambitions for your presidency? And Putin said, well, first I would like to help Russia to regain its status on the international scene, on the global scene, its former status. And so Kwaśniewski thought, okay, that's quite legitimate ambition. And he said, and second, I want to restore great Russia. And he said in Russian, Velikaya Rossiya, which is the Tsarist expression. And so the Polish president, as a good Pole, immediately reacted and thought, oh my God, he really wants to restore the Russian Empire. But that was in 2002. So that mission scared him, and he then left Moscow and told his European partners about this, his European colleagues, and they all dismissed him, saying, "Oh, but you Poles are, you're obsessed with Russia. You're Russophobes. You have had too many miseries in your history, and you're obsessed with history." And so they were all dismissive, and so he stopped talking about it and even thinking about it, because in 2002 he thought that, even though it could be Putin's dream, it was not attainable in at that time.
Right.
So so it was there, I think.
Yeah. At the same time, there was an initial period during the first years of Putin in which Russia was growing economically. Moscow became a comparatively wealthy, cosmopolitan city. The Russians seemed to appreciate that. The rest of the world began to think of Moscow as, again, kind of part of Europe in a sense. And then there was a kind of turning away from that. I wonder if you have a conclusion about why that turn away from that, because that potentially could have been a quite successful strategy.
Yeah, this we will never know, of course, unfortunately. But there were attempts. I mean, in the early 2000s, first, I think the West was quite happy to have some order being brought back to Russia, because the decade of the 90s with Yeltsin was very chaotic. And so for the West, it was, there was a lot of opening, but I think the West was uncomfortable, didn't know where this was going to. And so
it was really chaotic. And for the Russians, for everyday life was just really, people have a terrible memories of that decade. And it was very violent and everything. So when Putin arrived after Yeltsin, I think there was hope in the West that maybe with him we could do, bring things back, have some coherent and organized relationship with Russia. And he tried, probably. I mean, there's this very famous speech in 2001 at the Bundestag in Berlin, where Putin comes and really charms the German members of parliament by turning into. He starts his speech in Russian, and suddenly he switches to German, and he speaks very good German because he was posted as in East Germany as a KGB colonel for 5 years. So he speaks really excellent German, and that was really a charm offensive towards Germany, and it worked very well. And also that speech, so it's really a historic speech, that speech, and you can watch it on YouTube. It's fascinating. Even his body language he's a very good actor, actually. And he looks humble, and he comes with the olive branch, and it really worked, because that's what the Germans wanted to hear at that time. And remember that President Bush had met him and saw into his soul. Yeah, so there was also this episode, and that speech in Berlin was September 25, so that was 2 weeks after September 11. And so there was also this context that there was the possibility, and there was some cooperation in the war
Putin,
against
I think,
terrorism.
was the first foreign leader to call Bush after September 11th, for
Absolutely,
example.
yeah. So there was this atmosphere at the beginning, but then it turned sour, I think. Well, there was the war in Iraq, of course, which Russia, along with France and Germany, refused, to participate and was very critical of. And there was another factor, which was what we call the color revolutions. So in 2003 in Georgia and 2004 in Ukraine, there were those popular rebellions, I mean, against democratic movements, very spontaneous, but Putin, of course, didn't like them. And because he feared that they might spread to Russia, and also these were countries that he considered that as the near abroad, and that they shouldn't change. They should stay kind of semi-democratic and corrupt. And he suspected the West to have orchestrated those movements. And so he started to become suspicious and hostile. And I think that was the beginning of, that was the end of the real sincere attempts of friendship, I would say.
One question you pose fairly early in the book is why people didn't react more strongly to the brutality of the war that Putin conducted in Chechnya. You quote Nicolas Sarkozy complaining of the silence about the 200,000 people killed in Chechnya, and he says he would no longer shake the hand of Putin, but then did a big reversal, of course, and became quite pro-Russia in his policy. So why did people fail to fully reckon with the war in Chechnya and the brutality of it?
Yeah, that has bothered me as well. Yeah, why? Because we knew about the horrors and the brutality and how these wars, because there were two, were waged. I mean, the media reported on them our media, not Russian, and some Russian media, actually. There was a very brave journalist, Anna Politkovskaya, who was assassinated for telling the truth on Chechnya. So, no, we knew, but our leaders decided that first, I think it was an internal affair, because that was in Russia. So, didn't want to interfere in domestic affairs of Russia. So that was one explanation. And another explanation was probably because of the context of the war on terror or so. Yeah. But there were a few Western politicians who saw through, like Joschka Fischer, the Green leader of Germany, who was foreign minister at the time. He was Gerhard Schröder's foreign minister in a coalition government, and that's quite interesting about our blindness, if you want, because Joschka Fischer was very clear-sighted. He saw, because I asked him when I watched this YouTube video of the speech in the Bundestag, I saw that Fischer somewhere was not part of the general enthusiasm. He was not carried away like everybody else. He was, and so when I interviewed him, I said, "You didn't. Why did you stand apart? You didn't seem to enjoy the moment as all your colleagues." And he said, "I didn't trust him." And I said, "Why?" He said, "I felt already. I felt the nationalist in the man, and also because of Chechnya. So, and for him, Chechnya was really a problem. And yet, he was in government. He was the Minister of Foreign Affairs. He was in charge, not officially in charge of German diplomacy, but he didn't fight for this. He decided to let Gerhard Schröder, the Chancellor, conduct the policy towards Russia. And in fact, in Germany, mostly it's always the Chancellery, which is in charge of Russian affairs. And so you see, this is even the politicians who saw through Putin or had problems with Chechnya didn't really didn't have the guts to have an impact. And the intellectual in France, there was a very strong intellectual movement with André Glucksmann and the media about Chechnya, protesting about Chechnya. And I think that's one of the reasons why Sarkozy, you quoted him, that was during the election campaign. So he he had this argument of, we cannot forgive all these deaths in Chechnya, and I will never shake Putin's hand. But once he was elected, of course, he went to shake Putin's hand, and even more, because he even went to sell to helicopter carriers that France later had to cancel. They had to cancel the contract. So he had a very good cooperation with Putin, actually.
Yeah. So as a European, you focus understandably on the mistakes and blindness of European leaders. An American might be inclined to read this history somewhat differently and ask the question of whether the United States' eagerness to bring the countries of the former Warsaw Pact and then the breakaway parts of the old Soviet Union into the EU, into NATO, didn't create the kind of paranoia and sense of encirclement that might account for Putin's behavior. You quote Putin, for example, saying at the time that the U.S. was pushing to bring Ukraine into NATO, he said something like, I'm sort of translating from memory, the emergence of a powerful military alliance at our border is a direct threat to our national security. The fact that you keep repeating that this is not being done against Russia is of little importance. So is that another way of reading this history, or do you feel that that is a pretext on Putin's part?
That's a very important question, and which we keep wondering about regularly every time there's a problem with Russia. My my conclusion is yes, there's no question that Putin was hurt by the extension of NATO. EU, I think he didn't understand early on what it implied, but and that was European, former Warsaw Pact countries, not former Soviet republics, except the Baltic states, but the Baltic states had a specific status. But NATO, he mentioned it regularly, starting from 2000. That's another famous speech in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference where he mentions this. Now, was it a mistake on our part? That's in fact the question, right? On the west part, to extend NATO. There are two things, I think. First, when you were there at that time, and for instance, when you were in Poland or in Hungary, or in the Czech Republic, and these people had fought to liberate themselves, sometimes at very high cost, with our help. But I mean, mostly they did it themselves, right? Particularly in Poland. And they came to you and said, we want to join your military alliance because we're still scared of this big neighbor. He he occupied us once, or sometimes several times, and he may do it again. So we need your protection. So what are you going to turn them away and say, no, we cannot take you because it might hurt his feelings, you know, it might humiliate Russia, which is a very important expression, not to humiliate Russia. I think it was impossible. Politically, democratically, I think, you know, it was impossible to deny these people the right to join our alliance. Now, another argument, and I would like to quote Professor Pierre Vimont, who is here, and who I had this discussion with him because he was there in many of those events as a diplomat, either French or for the European Union. And Pierre Vimon's opinion is that we lacked imagination. And I think this is true, that at that time, at the time of those few years after the collapse of communism, we didn't have the courage or the imagination to invent a new model of international cooperation or security architecture or whatever you call it. But you know, we just applied the models we had. And these people from Poland, from, you know, new democratic states, that's the model they knew, and that's the model they wanted to join. Right. And of course, you know, and we did approach Russia. There was a NATO-Russia council. There were links. It's not like that we blocked the door immediately. There were attempts, but they didn't work.
Well, you reconstruct very well the negotiations in which, at the end of the Bush administration, Bush's people are pushing to bring Ukraine into NATO. Some of his own advisors are against it, Condi Rice, and
Bob Gates, apparently.
Yeah, and most of the Europeans are against it. And they end up with, in a sense, a compromise that is like the worst of both worlds, which is a promise to bring Ukraine into NATO at some undefined future point, but no immediate help. So in a sense, you have all the threat of the military with no support for Ukraine. And Putin reads that and then says, okay, I guess I have a few years to take care of Ukraine.
Yeah. So that's a very important moment, 2008, this NATO summit in Bucharest, where Bush, so it's April 2008, so it's Bush is really in the lame duck, right, late in his second term. And the last, I think it's part of his legacy of the freedom agenda. He wants Ukraine and Georgia to, he wants NATO to open the accession process to these two countries. And Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy are dead set against it because they fear that it will provoke Russia, because Ukraine is a former Soviet republic.
Right.
It's not like
not
Poland.
It's not a tiny Baltic state,
right.
which has no
right.
strategic importance.
Exactly, and we know that it's a very important republic for Russia because of the history and so on. So so Merkel really orchestrates a very energetic opposition front against Bush, and she holds her, you know, and that's quite interesting because for Germans to to resist America like this is quite. It takes some effort, but she did it, and she enrolled Nicolas Sarkozy in this effort, and so they both really put up a fight in Bucharest for 2 or 3 days. That summit lasted, and so it ended up, as you say, with this compromise, which was Ukraine will be a NATO member, but there was no timeline, no procedure, nothing.
Right.
So so it was the worst of both solutions, I think. And the Ukrainians then said, okay, yeah, the door is open, but we're not invited, right? And the fact is that to this day they are not NATO members, and we don't even know whether they will become in July at the Washington summit. So I think that was a terrible decision because, as you say, Putin understood that, okay, they're not going to, the West is not going to resist. And the fact is that 5 months later, he invaded Georgia under a pretext of, so there are endless academic discussions about whether that was the Georgians' fault or not. But the fact, that because I won't go into details, but the president of Georgia, Saakashvili, had reacted to a provocation in attacking an semi-autonomous small republic of province of Georgia. But the fact is that Russian tanks rolled into a sovereign and independent country, Georgia.
Right. Yeah.
And we didn't do anything.
Yeah. At the same time, in a way, it was revealing what the Europeans, in resisting Bush's push they say, are you prepared to go to war for Georgia? And the answer was no. The Americans weren't prepared to, and the Europeans weren't prepared to. One of the things that I found most interesting in reading your book is that it puts into question some of the basic principles on which we've been operating in the world in the last half century, really, which is both the idea of the kind of capitalist peace, the idea that countries that trade with one another don't fight each other, and that therefore, you refer to both the French and the Germans talking about changer pour le commerce, and also the sort of basic idea of modernization theory, that countries, as they become wealthier, become more democratic, and therefore that economic cooperation would lead to a natural lessening of tension, and that now is kind of in shambles. So I wonder how you've thought about that, those issues.
I have to say, one of the most interesting things I found while doing this research, or I learned, because I was pretty ignorant about Germany, I have to confess. And so I spent 7 months in Berlin doing this research, and I realized how important the German-Russian relationship is. It's fundamental in the history of Europe and in our contemporary Europe. And we can see it again now with the war, with the full-scale war in Ukraine, how the Germans react. And they are reacting quite strongly, and they are doing a lot. But the feeling they have is much more complicated towards this war than the feelings we have in France, for instance. Because for us, the relationship with Russia goes so long back in history, and it's so deep culturally, intellectually, politically, economically. It's a very rich and complex relationship. And of course, with all what happened in the 20th century, the 2 world wars, but also this one politician told me, we are two big nations of Europe which both committed monstrosities. So we have this in common. So that's Stalinism and Nazism, right? And so it's a very difficult, I would say, both rich and difficult relationship. And so they also had this Ostpolitik during the Cold War, which, as you described it, was developed into this change through trade policy. So they believed much more than the French, I think, or than the British, or that you can change a totalitarian or autocratic regime through trade. And of course, it was in their economic interest also. It served their economic interest. But there was also this kind of naivety. And I think it's still, I mean, the Social Democratic Party of Germany, Chancellor Scholz's party, is still struggling with this legacy, very much so. You have the Greens and the Liberals, which are the partners in the coalition, government coalition, being quite hardline on Russia at the moment in the war in Ukraine. And you have Chancellor more, he's still hesitating about how to, what weapons to send and how this will all end. And this is because of his party. And I think it's still a very, very important legacy of the 20th century. Yeah.
So you interviewed a lot of very interesting people for this book, and there's some nice portraits of some of these people in the book. For example, your encounter with Vladislav Surkov, sometimes referred to as Le Mage du Kremlin.
Mage du Kremlin, yeah, it's
And I wonder what encounters and meetings you had that made the greatest impression on you or that surprised you the most.
I may take two opposite characters. So the one person who really made a very big impression on me, and I start in the introduction by this describing this memory, is Andrei Sakharov, the academician, because I was, as a young reporter in Moscow, I was sent to cover his return from exile. He was in internal exile. He had been sent by Brezhnev to Gorky, to a place where foreigners couldn't go at the time. And he was there for several years, and he had two or three hunger strikes to protest and to get to because he was there with his wife, Yelena Bonner, and he wanted to get medical treatment for her, so he went into a hunger strike. Anyway, Gorbachev decided to release him as a gesture of, to show how his openness, both to the West and to probably to the Soviet Union at that time. And so he decided to let him come back as a free man to Moscow. And so with a few other reporters, I was in the station in that morning of December, very cold morning, to welcome him. And I was really impressed. I had never seen him, of course. He was in his 60s, but he looked much older because of all he had been through. But he was really an unbroken man. It was very impressive because as soon as he came out of the car of the train with his shapka on, and looking physically frail, but he looked very strong, in fact, and he said, "I will continue my fight for democracy," and so, and he didn't know much about what was going on because he had been secluded. So it was very, very, and he had an important role. Except that he died much too early in 1989, a couple of years later. So that was one person who really impressed me. And the other one who impressed me, but in the other way, maybe was Putin, because I had the opportunity to interview him, and the interview with 5 other Western journalists. And the interview, in fact, was turned into a dinner in Moscow. And so we had dinner for 2 hours together, and I was sitting next to him. And it was really interesting because he was so cold and and not making any effort to be nice. Politicians, and that was just before the election. in 2012, when he came back, he had been prime minister for 4 years to allow in order to be able to come back as a president. So that was just a few days before his election. And usually politicians, when they are running for election, they try to be nice, right? Especially with journalists. But he certainly didn't try, and he hated all our questions. I think he hated this whole dinner. And when is it because I knew that he had been a KGB officer, or was it really? But when he turned to you and answer your question, you think, oh, I'd rather not be interrogated by this guy. And one thing which really struck me is we were talking about the campaign, and I said, because he had refused to have a debate with the other candidates. Not that the other candidates were so threatening because they were selected and so on, but he didn't want to take part in a debate with them. So I asked him, I said, in our campaigns, debates are very important democratic moments. I don't think I even mentioned democratic. Are very important moments for voters. Why do you refuse to debate with them? And he looked at me like he looked sincerely surprised by the question, and he said, but why should I debate? I know their programs. And I thought, he doesn't even understand what debate is for, So he's very different.
Yeah. Well, it reminds me what you're saying about his attitude with the press. As somebody who's written about Berlusconi, there was a funny press conference with Putin and Berlusconi where, when it was still possible to ask tough questions of Putin, a Russian journalist asked a difficult question, and Berlusconi went,
really?
as if, like this, you're going to get yourself killed, which of course has actually happened.
They were quite close, I think.
Yes, very close. So you make some interesting parallels between Putin's invasion of Crimea in 2014 and the crisis of the Sudetenland in the Munich Agreement of 1938. And you mention some revisionist sort of interpretations of Munich, where Chamberlain has generally been interpreted as a coward and a deluded leader who believed that he was bringing peace to Europe by accommodating Hitler. And the film that you refer to, which Merkel evidently approved of, was that Chamberlain actually was a hero who bought time for Europe and the United Kingdom to rearm in order to defend itself at a later date. You don't seem to give a lot of credence to this idea, but in the case of Crimea, clearly no one was prepared. The European countries were not prepared to die for Crimea or for Ukraine. And it is true that after 2014, the United States, Great Britain began to help Ukraine build up its army so that it did in fact defend itself much more robustly than anyone expected in 2020. So it might not be true of Chamberlain in 38, but was there some wisdom in not pushing the Crimea crisis at that point?
So one of the most unsettling things that I found while doing this research was about the US attitude during Crimea, the annexation of Crimea. I didn't know about this, but I was told that by several people, Western and Ukrainian, that when Crimea was invaded and annexed, you remember those little green men and so on, which who came and for a few days we thought we didn't know who they were, but though it was pretty obvious, at least for the Ukrainians, it was obvious. And the Ukrainian military who were posted in Crimea surrendered without fighting. So I was told that the instruction from Washington, that was the Obama administration, relayed by Western diplomats in Kiev was that they should not resist. And honestly, one of the diplomats who had to relay this message, when he told me about this, he was almost in tears. I remember it, saying that had been one of the worst day of his career. And the Ukrainians told me, they were the new leaders of Ukraine who had after the Maidan revolution, so they had been in power for just a couple of weeks, and that was in fact Putin's retaliation to annex Crimea because of this regime change in Kiev. And so they had this meeting, which I found the minutes of the meeting of the new National Security Council of Ukraine with these new leaders, and they are discussing what to do on Crimea. And one of them says, we have to fight. We have to tell our army to fight there. And another one said, but we don't have any army left. I can mobilize at the maximum 5,000 men, and we don't have a real army. And another one says, but anyway, we have nothing to finance this. If we want to fight, the treasury is empty. There's nothing. The state was really completely ruined. And then another one, I think it was Yatsenyuk, the prime minister, who confirmed it to me, said, but anyway, our Western friends have told us that we should not resist, that they are not going to come to help us anyway, and they will not send weapons or anything. And so that was our attitude, right? And so I don't know what might have happened if those military had resisted. Would they have resisted? We know that a lot of them were Russian-speaking Ukrainians anyway, so did they really want to resist? I don't know. What would have happened? They would have been killed, probably. But, I think now we have this idea that, in fact, since they didn't put up a fight, they didn't resist, while in Donbass, they fought for Donbass, the Ukrainian army, then, it's true that, in fact, Crimea is not really Ukrainian. And so then when France and Germany organized those negotiations that we call the Normandy format with the Ukraine and Russia, this whole negotiation was about Donbass. It was not about Crimea. So, I think it was, it's something that I found very unsettling.
You, at a certain point, say that one of the great enigmas for you was Angela Merkel, that you found it hard to understand how a woman who grew up in East Germany, who understood communism, the Soviet Union, could have failed to understand Putin and his motivations to the extent that she didn't. How did you ultimately come to understand her? And another point that I think you make very well is that we tend to think of everybody as scandalized by Gerhard Schroeder's taking money from Gazprom and Rosneft, but one forgets that he was put there in part with Merkel's doing, and that there was consensus around that, the policy of Nord Stream and so forth. But I wonder how you untangle the enigma of Merkel and the...
I don't. I'm waiting for her memoirs, but which are supposed to come later this year in the fall. But I'm not sure we will get the answer in her memoirs. But she's been pretty silent lately. After she left office, it's pretty dramatic, because she was there for 16 years, very successful, very respected, in many ways, rightly so. And 3 months after she leaves, everything she has built collapses in a way. So that's because of the invasion of Ukraine. So all this gas relationship, which the German economy relies on, has to be completely changed. The relationship with Russia has to change completely. Of course, it's completely broken. And I told you about the importance of this relationship for Germany. Their attitude to defense, their defense forces are really very, very weak because they haven't spent any money on it, because they have decided that there was no threat. So they have to rebuild their army, their armed forces. So everything, is collapses of her universe collapses. So people are in shock in Germany because they were really in shock. And I remember journalists and media started to turn to her and say, "So what do you have to say?" And she was of course, it was very, very difficult for her, and she didn't come up with any real explanation except this one on Minsk, on the Minsk process, on the negotiations with Ukraine and Russia, saying that they had been buying time for Ukraine, which I don't think was really the strategy. But anyway, so I think eventually the reason why she went along with this policy, even though she was not blind about Russia and she was not blind about Putin, definitely not. She hated Putin. He behaved very badly with her since the beginning. But I think her priority was to make her country wealthy and to make her fellow citizens prosperous and wealthy. And she did what was needed to do this, which was to buy cheap Russian gas and make her country dependent on that Russian gas, whatever the compromission was.
Yeah. A final question before we open it to the audience, a slightly provocative one. Is it possible that Trump's anti-NATO, sort of provocations may actually end up benefiting Europe and forcing Europe to spend more on defense and develop a more realistic policy toward its neighbor?
Yeah, well, it had some effect already, but you may ask also, is it Putin or Trump who had really this defining impact? Yeah, Trump did shake Europeans in his presidency. But if you look at Germany, for instance, they only really started to spend money to increase their budget because of the Russian threat.
Right.
Not so much because of Trump. Now the real question is what happens if Trump comes back. But that's a question for you.
That's lucky for you, you go back to Paris.
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure we'll be so lucky because we'll all feel the effects.
We'll have to worry about that one.
Yeah.
So, do we have a few minutes for some questions from the audience?
Thank you very much for this great presentation. I had two questions. One is about the temporality, right? So you explained very well why, the West has been blindsided by Russia for so long, but it seems that and so like the long durée kind of causal forces, right? But what about the last few months? I mean, there is a real danger. And it seems that right now, I mean, the after the fall and the failure of the counteroffensive, it seems that now there needs completely new policy and new actions, and it's not happening, right? So it seems that the nature of the blindsidedness has changed, right? Because the danger is imminent. I mean, there is a guy who's been threatening with nukes, right? and nobody's helping Ukraine, or not substantially. So that's something that I found. I'd like to have your views on that. The other is a very French question. It has to do with the support for Putin in France, both on the far right and the far left. So far right is, we understand, right? They have the same agenda. They're anti-Europe. They're sovereignist. They're nationalist. The left is a little more difficult. Obviously there is an anti-NATO policy, but Mélenchon has been trying to get the quote-unquote Muslim vote in France. Is playing that card, right? And yet is supporting someone who has destroyed Chechnya. who has bombed Syrians, right? And he has actually, the very day after Aleppo, he was supporting Putin, right? He made statement in favor of Putin. So how does that work? How does this kind of the triangle works in France right now, right? With the support for Putin on the left. Thank you.
So about, I mean, the first. Sorry, what was the first question about? Yeah, the right, the now, what's happening now? Yeah. So I think European leaders are not blind anymore, but that it takes a lot of political will to find the money and the resources to help Ukraine, to support Ukraine. And we can see it here also, of course, I mean, in Washington, D.C. So I'm, for instance, the question of the ammunitions, I find it a shame that we haven't been able for the past more than 2 years that this full-scale war has been going on, that planners or defense experts, or in fact politicians, because I think the defense experts knew, but haven't been able to take the decision to put all these factories back in full gear. And so we are starting to do it now, but it's very late. And as you say, the situation on the front is very, very fragile, and there's the possibility that that the front collapses in the east, of Ukraine. So I find it's a very difficult moment, I think, and very dangerous, because of course the consequences of this would, would be absolutely terrible, not only for Ukrainians, but I think for Europeans also. So you're absolutely right. We really have a problem at the moment, and a political problem, not only. And regarding the French Russophilie, or there are two things. There's the traditional fascination with Russia, and there's the approval of Putin, and these are different things. I mean, Putinophilia, if you want. So the far right has really been careful since February 24, 2022, not to, they are trying to make people forget. Marine Le Pen in particular is trying to make people forget that she was a friend of Putin, and that she visited him, and that she borrowed money from him for her campaign, and so on. So she's, she obviously doesn't support him anymore, not publicly. She supports Ukraine. She's critical of the sanctions, but she's been very careful, because she knows that the public opinion is sympathetic towards Ukraine. The far left, I think Mélenchon's case is really it's Mélenchon, and I think he's not so powerful anymore. His power is decreasing. I mean, people are talking about, he's running for the European election, but number at the bottom of the list, so that he's not going to be elected. But everybody understands that he wants to stay in the race with regarding 2027, the presidential election, and nobody really wants him. I mean, in his own camp, right? In his own party, the younger generation is eager to take over, and they are wondering how to get rid of him. So I'm not sure what he says about Russia still has real influence. That's my opinion, but yeah.
Thank you so much for these great insights, and also for having written this very important book. I think when I look at the period, say 1991 to 2022, what strikes me is not only that Germany and France have been somehow blindsided by Russia, which I think is very true, but also the tremendous ignorance and neglect of Ukraine, right? Especially from today's point of view, it must strike us as extremely bizarre that what is the second largest country in Europe in terms of territory was practically ignored. Nobody really studied it, nobody really discussed it. So I was wondering how you relate to that in your book.
Yeah. No, that's a very good point. That and particularly in Germany, I think that this fascination for Russia in Germany really was detrimental to Ukraine, because there's a very good German historian, Karl Schlöger, who has written a book recently about how he's really a very, very good expert on Russia and on German-Russian relationship. He's very respected um, and knowledgeable. But in 2014, somebody took him to Ukraine, and he discovered that Ukraine was a country. And so in his book, which is about several cities of Ukraine, because now he knows the country very well, and in the introduction, he explains how his personal journey from Russia to, how he said, I was so fascinated by Russia that I didn't see there was a real country in between, right? And when the Germans tell you that Germany was responsible for the death of 27 million people in World War II, they think Russians. And they forget that among those 27 million, there were also Ukrainian and Belarusians and other nations. And so, Karl Schlöger, he calls this the Russian complex of Germany. And he came to Paris a couple of weeks ago for his book in French, for the publication of the French version of his book. And he gave a conference. And as I asked him, you tell in your book how you describe how you have got rid of your Russian complex, but do you think your fellow citizens have overcome their Russian complex? And he said, and that took him, into he grew almost emotional and said, no, and this is terrible, and I'm ashamed, and I'm so disappointed because I come from the left. I'm so disappointed by my government, and so on. It was really quite interesting, his reaction. So, but this is, about Ukraine, and I think also in France, most Europeans underestimated. Yeah, we kind of discovered that there were almost 40 million people living in that country. I mean, of course, now fewer, unfortunately, but you're right, yeah. But that's these countries in between. It's like Belarus, who knows?
Well, you quote this essay of Milan Kundera, which is very eloquent in basically saying that we all thought of ourselves as Europeans, and suddenly we were in Central Europe, and then suddenly with the Cold War, we were placed into this kind of place of forgetfulness in which we were just Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
And so it was all in a category that you didn't have to think about.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Someone else?
Thank you for this great presentation. You seem to be a bit critical of Angela Merkel's relationship with Russia during her times as the Chancellor of Germany. However, I feel like maybe Europe's relationship with some Arab countries in the Middle East that have very, to a certain extent, similar regimes than that of Russia could be criticized in the same way. So do you think that European leaders are currently being blinded by some leaders in the Middle East?
Yeah, that's the issue of double standards, of the democratic world, so I'm not an expert on the Middle East, but that's not a reason not to answer your question. I think you're right. I mean, there are double standards, but Russia is in Europe, so I'm not saying that the standards should be different, but this pragmatism or realpolitik or whatever you call it maybe was more understandable because it was Russia. But you're absolutely right. I mean, democratic leaders deal with all sorts of authoritarian leaders in the world, not only in the Middle East, and always find very good reasons to explain why they have this relationship. Yeah.
One last question.
Yeah, thank you. There is the topic that Berlin and Paris are becoming regarded as the old Europe. I mean, not irrelevant, obviously, because of their economies, but uh, discussions in literature talking about the center of gravity in Europe moving eastward, particularly Stockholm, Warsaw. Schultz said as much about a year ago, maybe over a year ago, when he was in Prague, that the center of gravity is moving east. Was he speaking in the moment? Was he pandering to the crowd, or was he unveiling a truth that is actually happening? And just a follow up question, could NATO become so unwieldy that it gives rise to regional defense pacts?
Mhm.
Thank you.
Very easy questions, yeah. So about the center of gravity, it's a very good, it's a very interesting point, because since for the past 2 years there's is the discussion whether the center of gravity of Europe is shifting to the east, and I liked this idea at the beginning, and then I realized that it's not so true, because the economic weight, the economic power in Europe is still very much in the West, in the western part of Europe. But I would say east and north, because now Sweden and Finland and Denmark, in a way also, and the Baltic states have much more of a voice. And they are, because they are, Finland has 1,300 kilometers of border with Russia, which is actually closed at the moment because Russia is in this hybrid war, is pushing migrants towards the Finnish border. And so they've closed the border. And they say that every time they open one border crossing to test, immediately there are migrants being pushed to the, all these countries are really on their guards, and they are, of course, the Baltic states are even really scared about what might happen to them again, and so they are very vocal. Yeah. Poland, of course, is also vocal and is also scared, and is, buying all these weapons and increasing its defense budget. And now they have a government which is much more pro-European and is now exerting influence in Brussels, which makes them have more voice. So I think, yes, they have more of a political influence, but I wouldn't say that's probably not enough to say that the center of gravity has really shifted. And the Franco-German relationship has been very, very shaken by all this, by the war in Ukraine. And so they're off balance now. Paris and Berlin at the moment don't have a good relationship. It's very complicated, it's difficult. And so they're trying to get Warsaw to help, this Weimar triangle to, so we had this meeting the other day of the 3 leaders, and everybody was saying that Donald Tusk was doing some couple therapy. But so it's really something which is in flux at the moment, yeah. And about regional alliances, I think we're not there yet. We'll see what happens if Trump is elected to NATO. It's true that in NATO, everybody's wondering what, because of the remarks that the statement he made, whether NATO can function without the Americans, for instance. I think it cannot. It's built by America and around America. So NATO without America is not going to continue. I mean, survive. I wouldn't. But then we'll talk about regional alliances. But that's a whole new world if it happens. Yeah.
Great. Why don't we end there? So listen, thank you so much for being with us.